It started with a simple text message from my mother. Short, polite, and perfectly cold. "We're aiming for a more refined atmosphere this year," she wrote, followed by a smiley face. I stared at the screen, reading it over and over, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew exactly what she meant. She didn't have to say the words out loud. Refined atmosphere was her way of saying my kids didn't fit her picture-perfect family gathering. It was a sentence dressed in elegance but dripping with rejection. I could almost hear her voice, soft, rehearsed, and heavy with judgment. For years, I had brushed off her subtle insults, her little comments about my chaotic life, my loud children, and my different choices. I told myself she loved us in her own way, that maybe I was too sensitive. But that message made something inside me still. It was like she had finally said what she'd been meaning all along. I sat at the kitchen table, my phone still in my hand, watching my kids play in the living room. Their laughter filled the house, echoing through walls that had known struggle but also real love. And I couldn't help but wonder, how could my own mother see these beautiful souls as unworthy of her table? The holidays had always been a mix of nerves and forced smiles for me. The way she arranged everything, the seating chart, the decorations, the conversation topics, all designed to maintain an illusion of grace. I used to think it was about family pride. Now I saw it was about control. Memories flooded back. The year she told me not to bring homemade dishes because they weren't presentation-worthy. The time she introduced my brother as the successful one and me as the one who tries. I had laughed it off then, trying to fit myself into her perfect picture, but this time, I couldn't. When I finally called her, my voice was steady. My hands were shaking. I asked her directly if the message meant what I thought it did. She paused, then sighed in that way she always did before saying something cruel with grace. "You know how kids can be, dear. We just want things peaceful." Peaceful. That word burned. I could almost see her sitting there, phone in hand, feeling righteous about her decision. She probably told herself it was for the best that I'd understand. But she didn't understand what it meant to tell a mother that her children weren't good enough for their own family's table. As I hung up, the scent of dinner from our own kitchen filled the air. Garlic, butter, something real. Not polished, not perfect, but ours. My kids were still laughing, still being loud, still being themselves. And for the first time, I saw that their joy didn't belong in her version of refined. I sat back in my chair, the message still glowing on my screen, and realized that maybe it wasn't just about this one dinner. Maybe this had been building for years, an unspoken hierarchy that had always placed me and my children just below her idea of family. The sound drifted through the narrow hallway. Muffled at first, then sharper, like whispers meant to wound without being heard. I paused mid-step, the smell of cinnamon and roasted vegetables heavy in the air, blending with something bitter I couldn't quite name. I shouldn't have been there early, but I wanted to help, to feel included for once. Instead, I stood still, realizing inclusion was never truly part of their plan. From the kitchen, my mother's voice floated out, calm and measured as always. "We just have to maintain a certain standard," she said, her tone dripping with that quiet superiority she wore like perfume. It was the kind of voice that could cut through a person without ever needing to raise in volume. Then came my father's low rumble of agreement, steady and sure. "Ryan's family has always known how to behave," he added. The words hit harder than I expected, even though a part of me had long suspected them. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a declaration, a ranking system, a cold, clear line drawn between who was acceptable and who wasn't. I stood frozen behind the wall, my hands clutching the edge of the doorframe, the warmth from the oven seeping into the air while something inside me turned cold. It was one thing to feel unwelcome. It was another to hear it, spoken aloud, with such confidence, as if it were an undeniable truth. Mom continued, her voice soft but firm, the way she used to correct me in front of guests when I was younger. "I mean, It's not her fault, really. She's always been different. That word echoed. Different. The same word she used when I dressed the way I liked, when I raised my kids my way, when I made choices she didn't approve of. Dad chuckled lightly, a sound that used to mean comfort when I was small but now just sounded cruel. She tries, he said, as if I were a child again, fumbling to meet some invisible standa, they'd invented. I pressed a hand over my mouth, afraid the smallest breath would give me away, afraid they'd see how deeply their words still had power over me. From the living room, I could hear the faint hum of laughter, Ryan's voice light and confident. He was the golden one, always had been, the one whose mistakes became lessons, whose flaws were charming, whose children were well-behaved. And me? I was the shadow that made his light brighter in their eyes. I could picture it all without even looking. Mom adjusting the silverware just so, Dad nodding approvingly, the kind of picture-perfect family moment that would have made for a beautiful photo if not for the ugliness underneath it. Their version of love was conditional, and I had spent my whole life trying to earn it without realizing it was never really on offer. I backed away slowly, every step heavier than the last, the sound of their voices following me like ghosts. Each word stuck to me. Standards, behave, different. Labels I had been branded with since childhood, etched so deeply that even now, hearing them out loud still burned. In that moment, standing in the dim hallway, I realized that the betrayal didn't start that day. It had always been there, disguised as tradition, wrapped in politeness, hidden behind closed doors that I had never truly been welcome to walk through. Every memory came flooding back like a storm I had tried to forget, moments I'd buried under layers of understanding and excuses. The forgotten birthdays, the missed calls, the years of showing up and still never being enough. It was all there, lined up in my mind like old photographs that refused to fade. I could see the pattern now. It wasn't carelessness, it was a choice. I remembered the year I turned 10, waiting by the window for a birthday cake that never came. Mom had called later that night, apologizing, saying they lost track of time after Ryan's soccer game. I believed her then. I told myself I was just unlucky, that things got busy. But deep down, I think even that little girl inside me knew better. Then there was my high school recital, the one I practiced for months. I looked into the audience that night, searching for familiar faces. Ryan was there, smiling in his suit, surrounded by our parents. They'd come early to watch him receive an award for something I can't even remember now. But by the time it was my turn on stage, their seats were empty. They had already left. The pattern followed me into adulthood, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. When I got my first apartment, Dad told me not to get too comfortable because renting wasn't real success. But when Ryan bought a house with their help, they threw him a party and called it a proud family moment. I congratulated him, of course. What else could I do? It was the same story every holiday, every reunion. Ryan's kids arrived in coordinated outfits, greeted with laughter and hugs. Mine came with crayons in hand and curiosity in their eyes. And somehow, that was always too much. The noise, the mess, the energy, all of it was a reminder to my parents that my life didn't fit into their tidy picture. I tried to rationalize it for years. Maybe they were just old-fashioned. Maybe I misunderstood their ways of showing love. I told myself that people love differently, that maybe their expectations came from fear, not favoritism. But those excuses started to crumble the more I looked back. There's a difference between imperfect love and conditional love, and I had been living under the latter. There were smaller things, too. Tiny slights that built up like dust in corners wide. You stop noticing until the light hits them. The way Mom corrected how I spoke in front of others, the way Dad sighed when I talked about my work, the way they used silence as a weapon when I disappointed them. Each moment seemed insignificant alone, but together, they formed a map of neglect I had followed all my life. Ryan's kids would show them report cards, and they'd beam with pride, showering them with words like brilliant and gifted. My daughter once brought them a handmade card covered in glitter and love. Mom smiled politely, said, "How nice," and set it aside. I caught my daughter watching her, confusion clouding her joy, and I realized it had started again. The cycle repeating in another generation. I started seeing it everywhere. The way my parents' eyes lit up when Ryan spoke. How they hung on his every word like it carried more weight than anyone else's. When I spoke, they nodded absently, already looking past me. It was like I'd spent my entire life being an echo in a house that only listened to one voice. And as I stood there now, hearing their words from the kitchen, their calm, casual cruelty, it all finally connected. The forgotten birthdays, the skipped recitals, the polite dismissals. They weren't coincidences or oversights. They were proof. Proof that I had never been first, never even equal, just second best, and expected to be grateful for it. The words slipped out of my mouth before I even realized I'd made the decision. If my children aren't welcome, neither am I. They hung in the air like smoke, soft at first, but impossible to ignore. My mother blinked, her perfectly composed expression faltering for just a moment, as though she hadn't expected defiance from me. It wasn't the volume of my words that startled her. It was their certainty. I had spent my entire life explaining myself to her, explaining my choices, my tone, my parenting, my boundaries. Every conversation was a negotiation, a battle I entered unarmed. But this time, I didn't reach for justification. I didn't try to soften my edges or make her understand my pain. I simply stated a fact, and for once, I let the silence do the rest. Mom's lips tightened, that familiar look of disapproval returning to her face. "Don't be dramatic," she said, the same way she always did when she wanted to shrink me back into the version of myself that obeyed. The words used to sting, to make me question whether I was overreacting, but now they sounded different, smaller, weaker, almost desperate. Dad stayed quiet, eyes fixed on the table like a man hoping to disappear. That was his way. To let Mom carry the cruelty while he hid behind neutrality. His silence had always been his weapon of choice. I used to mistake it for peacekeeping, but now I saw it for what it was. Complicity wrapped in cowardice. He wouldn't meet my gaze, and I didn't need him to. His silence spoke loud enough. I could feel the weight of every unspoken apology pressing at the back of my throat, begging to escape. The old me would have explained, would have said, "I'm not trying to make a scene," or, "I just want to be treated fairly." But I didn't owe them explanations anymore. Not for protecting my children. Not for walking away from harm disguised as family. The chair scraped against the tile as I stood. The sound felt final, like a door closing inside me that could never be reopened. Mom's face shifted from annoyance to disbelief. She wasn't used to losing control of a conversation. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. The woman who built her identity on being the one everyone deferred to. But then I remembered the look in my children's eyes when she dismissed them as too energetic, and any trace of pity vanished. I walked past her, the air thick with tension. The clinking of dishes and murmurs from the living room filled the silence I left behind. I could feel her eyes on my back, sharp and disbelieving, but I didn't turn around. Every step I took away from that table felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from the strange, powerful calm that comes when you finally stop trying to be understood by people who never wanted to understand you. I didn't tremble. I didn't falter. My body knew before my mind did that this was the only choice left to make. The hallway stretched long before me, lined with family photos, the curated version of our lives, full of smiles that never reached our eyes. I caught my reflection in one of the frames, and for a moment, I barely recognized myself. There was no pleading in my expression, no trace of the girl who used to chase their approval, just resolve. At the door, I paused. I half expected someone, Dad maybe, to call after me, but no one did. The only sound was the quiet hum of conversation resuming behind me, as if I had never existed. And somehow, that silence confirmed everything I needed to know. It was late, the kind of late where the world feels quiet, but your mind won't let you rest. I sat at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop screen washing everything in pale blue light. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe just a distraction from the ache still echoing after that dinner. But then I opened my banking app, and in a single glance, my heart began to pound. Something was wrong. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Numbers that didn't add up, transactions I didn't recognize. My eyes darted down the list, scrolling faster and faster, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. The amounts weren't small. Thousands upon thousands, vanishing from my account like sand slipping through my fingers. I clicked View Full Statement, and that's when I saw it. $93,000. Gone. I stared at the number for a long time, hoping I'd read it wrong. But the breakdown told a different story. Designer boutiques I'd never set foot in, airline tickets I'd never booked, 5-star hotels, luxury restaurants, and one line that made my blood run cold. Ryan's children's private school tuition. It didn't make sense. Not until it did. My hands started shaking as realization crept in. The authorization emails. The linked account my mother had insisted on years ago, just in case of emergencies. The times my dad had asked for a little help while waiting for a check to clear. Every vague story, every guilt trip about family supporting family. It was all connected, every thread leading back to the same deception. I opened more statements, digging through the last few years like an archaeologist uncovering the ruins of my own trust. There were charges buried under clever labels, transfers disguised as loan repayments. They hadn't stolen once. They'd been stealing for years. My parents hadn't just crossed a line, they'd built their lives on the other side of it, using my name as their bridge. A flash of memory hit me. My mother showing off a new handbag, claiming it was a gift from Dad. The way my father had bragged about the family vacation they took without inviting me, saying they'd found a great deal. And I had smiled, oblivious, proud even, that my parents were living comfortably. That pride now twisted into disgust. I scrolled through every transaction, each one cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just about the money. It was the betrayal hidden in plain sight. They hadn't asked. They hadn't warned me. They had taken my generosity and turned it into entitlement, my love into leverage. And I had funded it, unknowingly, with every ounce of trust I had left. I printed the statements, each page trembling in my hands as they slid from the print. Seeing the evidence on paper made it real. Cold, undeniable proof of just how far they'd gone. My parents' signatures stared back at me like ghosts, mocking the daughter who'd never thought to question them. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I thought about calling them, demanding an explanation, screaming until they heard me. But what words could make sense of something like this? What excuse could make theft feel like love? So I sat there, surrounded by paper and lies, realizing that the betrayal hadn't started with the money. It had started years ago, with every manipulation, every favor, every time they made me feel guilty for saying no. The stolen $93,000 was just the receipt for a lifetime of taking. I spread the papers across my dining table, each one a piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. The neat rows of numbers stared back at me like silent witnesses, proof of every betrayal, every carefully crafted lie. I grabbed a pen and started circling the transactions, highlighting dates, connecting patterns. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. It was a system. A carefully planned routine built on my trust. I opened old text threads, scrolling back through years of messages. Can you cover this for now? We'll pay you back next month. You're the only one we can count on. Words I used to read with pride now felt poisonous. Each thank you was just bait, keeping me hooked, keeping me quiet. I took screenshots of everything, the dates, the tone, the guilt-laced language. Each capture felt like a small act of justice. Emails came next. I searched for old attachments, payment confirmations, forwarded receipts from stores I'd never visited. There it was, my mother's name attached to purchases in luxury boutiques. My father's approval messages sent. Minutes before another charge appeared on my card. It was all there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for me to open my eyes. As I built the folder, digital and physical, something inside me shifted. For years I had felt powerless, trapped in their cycle of shame and obligation. But now, holding the evidence, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Control. Each screenshot, each statement, each message was a brick in a wall I was finally building to protect myself. The nights blurred together as I organized everything. I labeled files, color-coded evidence, made timelines. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about clarity. For the first time, I could see the truth instead of just feeling it. Every lie had a timestamp. Every manipulation had proof. The fog they'd kept me in for years was finally lifting. I started recording my own thoughts. Voice notes whispered late at night when sleep refused to come. "They used me," I said softly into the microphone, "and they thought I'd never find out." Hearing the words out loud made them real. My own voice no longer trembled when I spoke the truth. I found old voicemails too. My mother crying about overdue bills that didn't exist. My father blaming financial strain for why they couldn't help me when I needed them most. Listening to them now, with evidence spread before me, I heard what I'd missed before. The manipulation behind every sob, the calculation behind every plea. I created backups of everything, on drives, in the cloud, even printed copies hidden in a locked drawer. I wasn't going to let this evidence disappear. They had erased my boundaries for years. They wouldn't erase the truth. Each file I saved felt like reclaiming another piece of myself they had taken. There were moments I had to stop and breathe, my hands trembling as I held another printed statement. It wasn't easy seeing the betrayal written in ink, realizing the people who taught me about honesty were the same ones who lied without hesitation. But I kept going, because I knew this was no longer about the money. It was about my dignity. By the time I finished, the dining table looked like a war room. Receipts, bank statements, screenshots, and emails forming the map of my family's deceit. I stood there, staring at it all, my heart pounding not with fear anymore, but with quiet determination. For once, their lies didn't crush me. They armed me. The air in the dining room felt thick when I walked in. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. My mother's startled, my father's narrowed, my brother's cold and calculating. No one had expected me to come, not after the last argument, not after I'd stopped answering their calls. But I was done hiding. I held the folder tightly in my hand, feeling the weight of years inside it. Not just paper, but pain, silence, and proof. My mother was the first to speak. "You can't just walk in here like this," she said, her voice sharp, her fork suspended midair. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see a mother. I saw a woman who had used guilt as currency, love as leverage. "I think I can," I replied quietly, setting the folder down on the table. My voice didn't tremble this time. The sound of the folder hitting the wood cut through the room. My brother smirked, leaning back in his chair like this was some sort of performance. "What's this, another dramatic episode?" he asked. I didn't respond. I just opened the folder, pulled out the first document, and slid it toward him. "Read it," I said simply. His smirk faded when he saw his kid's school tuition listed under my credit card. My father shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "There must be some misunderstanding," he muttered, but his eyes avoided mine. "No," I said, flipping to the next page. "No misunderstanding, just years of transactions, stolen money, and forged signatures." I laid out the papers one by one. Every receipt, every fake emergency, every lie neatly printed in black and white. The table filled with their deceit until there was no space left for denial. My mother's face turned pale. "Where did you get all this?" she whispered, her voice trembling now. I met her gaze steadily. "From my bank, from my records, from the truth you hoped I'd never look for." Her hands fidgeted with her napkin, the same way they used to when she'd scold me as a child. But now, she was the one cornered, and there was no script to save her. My brother tried to laugh it off, saying, "You're overreacting. It's just money." I turned to him, my voice calm but cutting. "No, it's not just money. It's my trust. It's every time you told me you were broke while you took vacations on my card. It's every guilt trip disguised as family loyalty." The color drained from his face as the guests around the table exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. I could feel the shift in the room, the power they'd held over me, the control, the shame. It cracked and fell apart like thin glass. They had built their authority on the assumption that I'd always stay quiet. But now, every word I spoke stripped away their illusion. "You wanted to humiliate me for standing up for my children," I said slowly. "But tonight, you'll remember this. I was never the embarrassment. You were." My father slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Enough!" he barked. But it was too late for authority. His voice no longer carried the same weight. I didn't flinch. I slid the final page across the table, the one that showed the full total, $93,000. The number stared up at them, undeniable. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but not the kind that come from remorse, the kind that come from exposure. "You're ruining this family," she said, trying to reclaim the moral high ground she'd always used to silence me. I let out a small, humorless laugh. "No," I said softly. "I'm just showing everyone what this family really is." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear away. The guests, relatives, family friends, neighbors, sat frozen, watching the performance unravel. Whispers spread through the room like fire. Every secret, every manipulation, every hidden truth was now out in the open. I didn't raise my voice, didn't shed a tear. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for me. For once, they had to sit and listen, just like I had for years. The room was filled with polite chatter when I stepped onto the small stage, holding the flash drive that contained years of deceit. Faces turned toward me, neighbors, church members, distant relatives, all people who had known my parents for decades. They smiled at first, expecting another one of my mother's charity speeches or my father's proud stories. But when I began to speak, that smile slowly faded. My voice didn't shake. I was calm, almost too calm. "I have something to share," I said softly. Something I should have shared long ago. A hush fell over the hall. My parents sat near the front, side by side, their expressions frozen. My mother's hand tightened around her clutch, my father's jaw clenched. They didn't know what was coming. Not exactly, but they could sense it. I plugged in the flash drive, connected it to the projector, and let the first recording play. The sound of my mother's voice filled the speakers. "She'll never say no. She's too scared to disappoint us." Gasps rippled through the audience. I watched their faces, the same faces that had once looked down on me, pitying the ungrateful daughter who supposedly caused her parents stress. I saw the confusion shift into disbelief, then disgust. Every voicemail, every text, every staged emergency, it was all there. My father's voice came next. "Don't worry, she'll send the money by morning. She always does." My brother's laughter followed, mocking me, bragging about how easy it was to get what they wanted. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. My mother stood up abruptly, trying to stop the video. "That's enough," she said sharply, her voice trembling. But I didn't stop it. I looked at her and said evenly, "You taught me to never interrupt someone when they're speaking. Tonight, It's my turn. A few people gasped. Some even clapped quietly. For once, I had the floor, and there was nothing they could do to take it away. The next slide appeared. Screenshots of messages, bank statements, fake signatures. Every transaction was there, labeled and dated. $93,000 worth of betrayal. My father's face turned red. He muttered under his breath, trying to explain, but no one was listening to him anymore. The proof was right there in black and white. Years of manipulation laid bare before the very people they'd fooled. I could feel my heart pounding, not from fear, but from something else. Release. Every time they told me to keep family matters private, what they really meant was keep their image intact. Now, their pristine reputation, the one they'd built on my silence, was crumbling in front of the people whose opinions they valued most. The irony almost made me laugh. My mother's friends looked horrified. A few whispered to each other, covering their mouths. The same women who used to tell me, "Your parents are saints," now stared at them as if seeing strangers. My father tried to stand, but his legs gave out half an way, and he sank back down. My brother, sitting beside him, stared at the floor, his hands shaking. The proud, untouchable family was gone. All that remained were the cracks they'd tried to hide. As the final clip played, my mother mocking me, calling me our little ATM. The silence was deafening. No one spoke. No one moved. The image on the screen froze, and I looked out at the audience. "This," I said quietly, "is what love looked like in our home." My voice didn't tremble. It was steady, cold, and clear. The kind of voice that comes from someone who's finally done being broken. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God," and that was all it took. The room erupted in whispers, murmurs, and shifting gazes. People turned to look at my parents, some shaking their heads, others avoiding eye contact altogether. My mother's lipstick-stained smile had vanished completely. My father stared straight ahead, hollow-eyed, like a man watching his own legacy burn. I stepped back from the projector, my hands steady. The truth was out there now, raw and undeniable. The same community that once saw me as a problem child now knew who the real manipulators were. Every lie they told, every story they spun to make me look ungrateful, dissolved under the weight of evidence. And I didn't have to say much. Just press play and let their own voices destroy the illusion they'd spent a lifetime protecting. The moment the final recording ended, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush the air. My parents sat motionless, the weight of decades pressing down on their perfect postures. The people they once manipulated with charm and polished smiles were staring at them, not with admiration, but with disgust. For years they had played the role of the noble parents, the selfless caregivers, the victims of an ungrateful daughter. But now, that script was gone. Every word they'd use to control me was exposed for what it truly was, a weapon. I could see my mother's composure breaking. Her lips trembled as she tried to force out a smile, but it came out twisted and desperate. "You don't understand," she said to the crowd, her voice shaking. "Families have disagreements." But even she didn't believe her own words anymore. The room wasn't buying the act. For the first time, people were seeing her, not as the sweet, nurturing woman she pretended to be, but as the cold strategist behind every guilt trip and manipulation. My father shifted uncomfortably, his usual dominance replaced by something unfamiliar. Fear. His silence, once a powerful form of control, now betrayed him. He used to rule with it, letting his disapproval hang in the air like a punishment. But now, that silence was a confession. His eyes darted toward the projector, then toward me, as if trying to find the right move, the next lie to fix everything. But there wasn't one. Every secret he'd buried had been unearthed, and Ryan, my brother, the golden child who could do no wrong. His smirk was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like shame. He stared down at his hands, fidgeting with his watch, his arrogance slipping away piece by piece. The world that had always revolved around him was tilting, and for once, he wasn't the hero of the story. His voice, usually dripping with superiority, was quiet. The silence between us stretched, filled with all the things he'd taken and all the times I'd forgiven him. The whispers in the audience grew louder. I heard fragments. Unbelievable. How could they? I never thought. Each voice was another crack in the empire my parents had built. Their reputation had been their strongest weapon, the mask they hid behind while they drained me emotionally and financially. Now that mask was slipping, and beneath it was the rot they'd spent years concealing. Every person in that room had once believed them. Now, those same people were watching the illusion collapse. My mother reached for my father's arm, but he pulled away. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. The alliance between them, the unbreakable front they had maintained for decades, was fracturing right in front of everyone. I could see it. The fear, the blame, the realization that they'd lost the one thing they valued most: control. Their empire wasn't built on love or truth. It was built on silence. And I had finally taken that away from them. Someone in the back of the room stood up and said quietly, "I always wondered why she looked so tired all the time." Another voice followed. "Now we know." It wasn't pity in their tone. It was recognition. People were connecting the dots, realizing how perfectly orchestrated my parents' manipulation had been. The sympathy they once reserved for my family now shifted toward me. The leash of guilt that had kept me tethered to them for years was disintegrating, one witness at a time. My mother tried to regain control, straightening her back and forcing her voice to steady. "We did what we had to do for this family," she said. But the words rang hollow. Even she could hear it. Her authority, once so sharp and commanding, had dulled into something brittle. The crowd's silence was louder than any accusation. I stood there watching her struggle, realizing that the power she once held over me existed only because I let it. My father finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. "You should have come to us privately," he said. I turned to him, meeting his eyes, and for a moment I saw the faint flicker of the man I used to call my protector. "I tried," I said quietly. "For years." The words weren't loud, but they hit him harder than anything else I could have said. The truth had a way of echoing in silence, and in that moment, it did. The tension hung in the air like smoke. No one moved, no one spoke. My parents' empire, built on reputation, lies, and fear, had crumbled. Not with screaming or chaos, but with quiet, undeniable truth. And as the crowd looked at them, then back at me, I realized that something irreversible had shifted. The leash was gone, and for the first time in my life, I could breathe without their permission. When I stepped outside that hall, the cold air hit my face like a baptism. It was quiet. No shouting, no guilt, no one telling me what I owed them. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. I didn't look back at the building behind me. I didn't need to. The ghosts I'd carried out of obligation, fear, and love that was never returned. They stayed inside those walls. I was walking toward something new, something clean, something mine. The next morning, sunlight filled my kitchen. My children were laughing over breakfast, their voices filling the space that had once been heavy with tension. There was no pretending, no forced smiles, no feeling of being watched. Just laughter, pure and unfiltered. I stood there with my coffee, watching them, realizing that this was what freedom looked like. Not revenge, not payback, but peace that no one could steal again. Bills were smaller now. The phone was quieter. The absence of my family's constant demands felt strange at first. Almost too quiet, like missing noise that used to drown out my own thoughts. But slowly, that quiet turned into something I began to crave. I could hear myself think again. I could make choices without guilt whispering in my ear. I was no longer their provider, their pawn, or their emotional punching bag. My home began to feel different too. I took down the family portraits that had once hung like trophies of obligation, their smiling faces watching me from ever. I replaced them with photos of my children, of vacations we actually wanted to take, of moments we'd built on honesty, not fear. Every new frame felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost long ago. I started therapy, not to relive the pain, but to understand it, to untangle the guilt that had been stitched into my skin for so many years. Every session felt like peeling away another layer of shame that wasn't mine to carry. My therapist asked once, "What does revenge look like to you now?" I smiled. It didn't look like their downfall anymore. It looked like me standing tall without needing their approval. My children began to notice the change too. My daughter said one night, "You smile more now, Mom." I hadn't realized it until she said it, but it was true. The tension in my shoulders, the tightness in my chest, it had all started to fade. I was lighter, not because life was easy, but because it was mine. Every decision, every boundary, every quiet morning, it belonged to us, not to people who saw love as a transaction. I used to believe that walking away meant losing family, but I learned that sometimes walking away is the only way to find one. My children and I created new traditions, simple ones, movie nights, Sunday breakfasts, road trips to nowhere in particular. These weren't about appearances or expectations. They were about connection, real and raw, without conditions attached. There were moments, of course, when guilt tried to sneak back in, that old voice whispering, "But they're your parents." I learned to answer it with truth. Yes, they were my parents, but they were also the people who betrayed me, who saw my worth only in what I could give. Loving them had cost me my peace, and that was a price I would never pay again. I began sharing my story quietly online, not out of spite, but out of solidarity. The messages started to pour in, strangers from around the world telling me they had lived the same story under different names. "You made me realize I'm not crazy," one woman wrote. That message stayed with me. Maybe that was the real purpose behind it all, to turn pain into a map for others still lost in it. Now when I wake up each morning, I don't think about what they took. I think about what I reclaimed. My voice, my boundaries, my peace. The revenge I once imagined would destroy them ended up rebuilding me. I didn't need to burn their world down. All I had to do was step out of it and never walk back in.